Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Buckeye Weekly Podcast. I am Tony Gerdeman, here as always with Tom Orr. Tom, how's it going?
That was not nearly as long a pause as the last time. That was terrible. Not your best work. I was seriously thinking about counting 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, but then I thought that might really mess you up. So then I didn't. Tony, it's snowing. My kids are home from school yet again today. How do you think I'm doing?
Yeah, it is snowing as I look out the window, and I'm waiting for other school like early releases to coincide with my day here. Yeah, I'm done with the snow, Tom. I'm done with it. I'm opting out. I don't want it anymore. There's been enough, and part of my winter ritual is just constantly looking at the 10-day forecast for like the first stretch of like 40-degree days, like 3 in a row where like I think we've done it. I think we've made it. Fortunately, Wednesday is going to be like, I don't know, a high of 12. So not quite there yet, though. But we'll get there, perhaps. I don't know if we will. We may not.
Spring will come eventually, probably, maybe, hopefully.
One day of spring and then right into summer. That is how we do it here.
Exactly.
So this show is... we had one listener question that we really couldn't spend enough time on in the last show to really give it a good answer because it is such a deep and thought-provoking question. Tom, I don't actually have it in front of me. If you do.
Crackerjack job. Well done. You didn't also put in here who asked the question, so I will go ahead and plug.
You sent the question to me. You sent the link to me.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I did. Yeah, it's fine.
No,
all right, so
I have done a lot of preparation for the show. I just forgot that the actual wording of it.
The point is, this is all Tony's fault. So, Tony, what year do you think best describes the modern era of college football? Watching early 2000s games, they now feel dated. Feel like dated 1990s games, maybe 2010 and on. This is one that we just had in the list of questions to do for, in the middle of one of the other listener question shows. That's like, we could go for like 45 minutes on this because it all depends on how you'd like to define modern. How are we defining modern? I guess that kind of determines what the answer is.
And that is what I don't know. For me, modern, I guess what I would say, one of the definitions is when is the point where the people playing then can also play now? Like, can the players from the 80s play now? Would they be able to play now? And I think some, but the sizes of the lines of scrimmage were much smaller, but they would just bulk up today. I think like Luke Fickell, I think started as a 255-pound nose tackle at Ohio State. Now he wouldn't be able to do that today, but I'm sure he could be, he could play as a 285-pound nose tackle and grow from there. But I think there is a point where whether it's the 70s or 80s for me, where those guys probably couldn't play today. And I can't, anything before then, I don't know that I could call that modern era college football for me.
Yeah. And, if you're defining it that way, then yeah, that's probably the dividing line is Chris Carter could probably play today. But, you go back to, Archie Griffin, I don't think Archie Griffin would hold up well in today's college football. So if that's how we're defining it, then it's probably sometime early 90s, late 80s, something like that. Because you just, you look at the rosters in the 1950s and it's like the offensive lineman weighed 200 pounds. It's like, oh, you would be dead at the first practice, like literally dead. Like that would be like putting me out on the practice field. It's like, oh no, I just broke 7 bones all on one. And if this is a non-contact practice, how did that even happen? I don't understand. The game has changed so fast. Nutrition has changed so fast. Training has changed so fast that, you could put Terry Glenn on this year's Ohio State roster and Terry Glenn would still probably put up 1,000 yards. 1995 Terry Glenn probably puts up 1,000 yards receiving this year without having to materially change anything because fast is fast. And, he could catch the football and he could run real fast. And you put him, or you put Ted Ginn, or you put Santonio Holmes, or you put, any of those kind of guys on a Ryan Day team, and they would fit in just fine. Going back to the 70s, like the offensive linemen, they were not real agile. You didn't, I don't think any of what these guys would have done particularly well with the pass blocking schemes of the modern game and that kind of stuff. So yeah, if we're defining it in that way, then yeah, it's somewhere in that time range. What's interesting is I think that time range is kind of my answer, because I think I'm looking at this in a little bit of a different way. I'm looking at this in terms of like what was kind of like the change that led to the modern game. And, I think we can talk about integration later, because that's one potential, inflection point for the sport. To me, though, it's the 1984 Supreme Court decision, NCAA versus Board of Regents. If you're not familiar with that case, basically before that case, there was a football television committee that the NCAA had that, only one network had a contract to broadcast college football games. Like, if you wanted to watch college football games, hope you got ABC, because no one else had games. Like, no, there was nothing on CBS. There was nothing on NBC. Like, ESPN didn't exist back then for the most part until very late in that process. The University of Oklahoma and University of Georgia sued the NCAA. It went through a bunch of different levels of the court system. And then finally in 1984, the Supreme Court ruled against the NCAA. And that kind of changed everything, because, in 1983, there was $69.7 million in TV revenues for all of college football. That is the equivalent, if you run through a inflation calculator, it works out to like $195 million for the entire sport of college football for TV rights for the entire season. Just the college football playoff alone, the 3 games of the college football playoff this year was worth $475 million. So those 3 games were worth double what literally the entire sport of college football got in 1983. The Big Ten's next TV deal projected to be like $1 billion, billion with a B, $1 billion a year. That's the stuff that changed everything. When you started getting that level of money involved, first of all, when more games are being televised and more different places, college football all of a sudden becomes a national sport. It's not just, it's like, why did everyone care about Notre Dame in, all across the country? It's like, well, because there was one game on TV every week, and sometimes it was Notre Dame. And so then people all across the country cared about Notre Dame. And, Ohio State would have like 1 or 2 games on TV all season, maybe. And that was it. And so it was, as soon as you started having more games on TV, all of a sudden you could see SEC games every week. You could see Pac-12 games every week, which was Pac-10 back then. You could see Big 8 games. You could see Southwest Conference games every single week. That led to the nationalization of the sport ultimately, as that kind of continued. TV revenues just kind of went up, 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 up. All of a sudden, John Cooper's last season, he was making $600,000 a year. That was 22 years ago. Ryan Day is making 10 times that much now and is looking for a raise. The impact on the in-stadium experience, the amount of money in the sport, obviously changed the conversation around NIL, and it all kind of traces back to that one Supreme Court decision. So to me, that's where the sport really changed from what it was before, where it was just kind of, like one game a week, to like 43 bowl games, and there's 17 games on at the same time. And, some of them are on ESPN 64 and whatever. Like that's where it really kind of changed to me.
And that's the tangible thing. There's intangibles and there's tangibles, but even that ruling, it took years to get to where every game was nationally televised. Because, I've talked about it here before, but when I was, still middle school, junior high, maybe even high school, Ohio State could only be on 5 times a year on TV, like national television. And that was the rule. And now you still would get them on local. And then back in grade school, we would have to watch them the next day on the PBS replay to see the games. And so even after that ruling, it still took a long, long time to get to where we are today. But yeah, that was one of the beginnings of that, and the TV money and that has exploded everything. But that's not, that's an answer, Tom. That's not the only answer. And I agree, like the integration, the freshman eligibility, like that all, I think they're all stepping stones. The TV aspect of that, 1992, when you go from 95 scholarships to 85 scholarships, like this is all moving into the modern. And so I posed a question on Twitter and I threw it on the message board. A lot of the answers were beginning with the BCS, 1998, some with the Bowl Coalition a little bit before that, where you no longer voted. The BCS, you no longer vote on the national champion. You actually play it. And so I can see that, where now that's what the college game is now. But it's still quite different than then, because now there's also, I think, the second most popular answer, like what year? It's like 2021 with NIL, with the transfer portal, with all of these changes going on right now, conference realignment, where people feel like this is the beginning of modern football because it's cutting edge, and you're still not sure where it's going to end up, and it's so much different than what happened in the past. I know a lot of the responses I got from Michigan fans were saying 2021 was the beginning of the modern era, as you might suspect. But,
college football, 1890 to 1918, 2021 to present.
So, but I'm as you're talking, and I'll run down some of these other answers throughout the show, and I mean this with the most respect that can be given.
This is what someone says right before this is really disrespectful. Go ahead, Chief.
Well, not disrespectful, but perhaps not the Jerry Sandusky situation, where you go from people wanting to punish schools for actions and punish players to, punish and cheating in the NCAA. Oh, this guy got paid, he should never play again. Then you get to real violations that happened at Penn State. And then immediately after that, you have the Miami situation, and nothing really came of it. And people will start to get on the side of the players. Like, why shouldn't players get more out of this than they have been? And that proceeds to Johnny Manziel getting into a little bit of trouble for signing some autographs, but then getting right back on the field. And people are like, well, why can't he sign his name? And then you start hearing more and more and more about, name, image, and likeness. And then eventually we get here. So I think I don't want to say that that's the start of it, but I think that was also, if you're looking at today being modern football, like, I think there was a thing that happened right there that started to edge towards players' rights at that moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think the conversation around NIL and players' rights and transfers and all that kind of stuff has changed so dramatically in the last 10 years. Because, literally, I don't need to preach to an Ohio State audience about this. Literally, the last big NCAA case right before the Sandusky thing broke was the Tressel case. That was, the Tatgate case. And, you go back and read the reporting around that, and it's like, it's just the most hysterical, pearl-clutching nonsense. And it's like, oh my gosh, these players traded memorabilia and equipment for money and used that to buy a tattoo. And, maybe the coach was not completely forthright about the NCAA about this, the greatest transgression in the history of college sports. And it's like, you go back and look at it now, and it's like 750 people did something far significantly, at least along those lines, like 2 weeks ago. That's just kind of like, this is how it is now. You can, all the stuff that was, the worst violation in the history of the world in 2011 is now legal. Like that was all pretty much legal. And, if a coach had, not forwarded an email to the proper authorities or something, then and signed his name on a compliance thing months later about that, like that would get laughed at right now. And back then it was, this was the greatest sin that any person has ever committed. And, I think the fact that the rules have changed is an indication, like, okay, that was probably a stupid rule, and that probably wasn't a necessary rule at the time. So yeah, the conversation around that has changed quite a bit. I would say that's that's a little bit of, that's like a piece of college football, but I don't think that necessarily defines, the NIL stuff defines an era of college football, which, this is like, every 18 months Time Magazine comes out with a new generation. It's like, oh, now it's generation, Z part 3. And it's like, well, those are babies born between June of 2002 and July of 2003, except for mid-December, because those don't count for, it's like, okay, like you're just looking for, you're splitting things a little too finely right now. I think that's, moving forward, I can make an argument for 2021, but backward modern football, I would say modern football, started before July of this year.
So when I threw the question out there, I did get some celebrity responses. If you want to consider people in the college football sphere celebrities, our buddy Ari Wasserman said 2000 because that's when recruiting rankings began.
What are his thoughts on stars?
Our buddy Bill Landis said September 8th, 2018.
Oh, yes. That was the date of the Ohio State Rutgers game. I don't even need to look it up. September 8th, 2018.
But Joey Kaufman from the Dispatch was the one who said 1972 with the post integration and freshman eligibility, which now, how about this one, Tom? I think you could argue the end of Nebraska football, like the 2001 season after Miami beat them. That was Colorado beat them the game before that, like 62-21 or 62-31. Miami ends up beating them 37 to whatever. And that was pretty much the end of the triple option as a viable course to a national championship.
Yeah,
I think from there, you then it's more about pro style offenses, and you do eventually get back into the Rich Rodriguez stuff, but you still have to throw the ball, and there's avenues to it, but it's no longer this wishbone, this I-form, triple option. It's more even the read option and triple options that West Virginia would run was new, and it didn't necessarily carry back from decades before. There were some new tweaks and twists to it. So it was a new era of that style. But I think you could argue once that triple option is no longer a viable way to a championship, now you're talking more modern football.
Yeah, that's an interesting one where, I thought about the, introduction of spread offenses, and Rich Rodriguez was kind of on like the cutting edge of that in a lot of ways. I think you had some of that with Urban Meyer and the kind of the read option. He was running that back at, Toledo, Bowling Green and Utah. So that's similar. Now, I think, there's an argument to be made that Pat White threw for 1,700 yards in 2007, and Eric Crouch threw for like 1,500 yards in 2001. So, it's not like they were throwing it substantially more than Nebraska was. But yeah, I think, that spread offense definitely has changed the game, because that was like revolutionary when West Virginia was running it. And then suddenly everyone was running it. And then now the defenses are sort of shifted back to, adjust to some of that stuff. And so that has definitely changed the game. I think that's where the dividing line for modern college football offense is. The era of modern college football offense is probably, I like the end of the Nebraska era as kind of being that, as soon as Bill Callahan walked on campus at Nebraska, that was kind of the end of that as a, anything other than kind of a niche thing that you did when you don't have better options, when you don't have, when you don't have the personnel, so you got to do something weird. That's not a bad argument in terms of, modern college football offenses. Do you include that 2005 season with, Vince Young in Texas? That's probably, they were running read option stuff, so they're probably in there, even though
he threw for over 3,000 yards too.
Yeah. And USC was, USC was more of a pro style team at that point. So you still had, that's an interesting mixture there. Another thing, and I do want to get into the integration thing that Joey mentioned, but, something else that kind of gets you in that kind of late 80s, early 90s time period as maybe the answer here is you had conference expansion start to happen then. SEC adds Arkansas and South Carolina in 1992. which brings them to 12 teams, which means that 1992 was also the start of the conference championship game era. That was the first SEC championship game was 1992. 93, the Big Ten brings in Penn State. That's, and you start to see some of those modern conferences sort of take shape a little bit more. And you've got, you're kind of in the heyday of Bobby Bowden down in Florida State. You're starting to see, with Miami in the kind of mid 80s, and then Florida under Spurrier in the early 90s, and then Florida State in the late 80s, early 90s. The sport starts shifting to Florida, because the state of Florida before the mid 80s or the early 80s, when Bobby Bowden got there, and some of his earliest scalps were the Buckeye teams in the real early 80s. Before that, like the state of Florida, there was just it was like nothing. There was not you think of the sport like running through the state of Florida. That was not the case before the early to mid 80s. So I think the more we talk about this, the more I think I'm sort of landing on mid 80s or so, where the TV stuff, where the sport is sort of starting to shift in terms of geography. The style of play was a little bit, obviously, you still had a lot of, there was a lot of wishbone Barry Switzer and triple option Tom Osborne still kind of in the works at that point. But it feels like that, and the conference realignment stuff, it feels like that kind of is really the modern era of college football in a lot of ways. But again, the integration piece, like, holy smokes, like, as someone who was born in the late 70s, so this is all just history book stuff to me. But yeah, my parents were in college, and Texas won the national championship with an all-white team in 1969. That was the last all-white team to win the national championship. It's like, what? That was less than a decade before I was born? That doesn't seem possible.
No, it doesn't. And that even goes, that's earlier than my or later than my encyclopedias as a kid, my trusty 1961 World Book Encyclopedia, where JFK was still the president in 1987. And anything before then, it's that how can you really count? I saw somebody responding to my question saying, 1930 with this reason. Like, no. That's almost 100 years ago. There's nothing
right.
modern about 1930 anything.
Yeah, that's like looking at 1930s baseball and being like, well, Babe Ruth played. So it's like, well, yes, but it's like the live ball era. Like, okay, but like half of the sport couldn't actually play due to rules that were, later voted out. Like modern baseball, I will kind of accept 1947 as an answer, kind of, sort of. I think you probably, baseball probably changes more after the lowering of the mound following the 68 season, but that's a whole nother conversation we can have at a different time. But, in terms of this, I don't think any answer before the integration of the sport holds much water with me.
No, none for me. And that's where it begins. And then we go from there. Anything before that that's just distant past. That's it's not that distant past, but it's not actual college football in terms of what it could have been, and certainly what it is today. And it's a different population and very much different opportunities and essentially a different sport. The Florida thing that you're talking about, Tom, is interesting to me. What about if it's when you had Miami, Florida State, and Florida all going? Because those were all pro style offenses. It was there's nothing, and Spurrier gets to Florida in 1990. The early 90s with Miami, Florida State, and Florida, early to mid. I don't know exactly when Spurrier started going crazy at Florida. I'm trying to scroll down his Wikipedia page here. But when you had so the 91, he was 10-2, 1990, he was 9-2, winning the SEC. So obviously you had Florida State at that same time. You had Miami. That might not be a bad answer, because that really started to everybody was taking notice then, because like you said, you could ignore that region, and then Howard Schnellenberger and Jimmy Johnson and all of these great coaches get in there, and that's an interesting idea. That may be more of the intangible rather than the tangible, where you have like the TV thing and certain markers, actual calendar dates, whereas this is kind of a feel. One of the Andy Staples suggested in 2008 with the current clock rules and the influx of offensive football, where you remember 2006 when they started the clock on the kickoffs, which I absolutely hated because they thought the games are going too long, and so they scrapped that rule for the 2007 season. In 2008, they added a 40-second play clock for most of the game. I think in the last 2 minutes of each half, it goes back to 25. But when I initially read this, I kind of go to 1994 Penn State offense, 1995 Ohio State offense, and maybe the fact that we're looking at it, or that I am looking at it as just an offensive metric, is that maybe off base, where, because you can go back to looking at some old Ohio State defenses where it's like a 5-3, 3 or whatever, and you've got middle guards, and this middle guard is also a linebacker, and this guy can play 3 spots, and so defenses have also genuinely changed because they've had to counter these offenses. But it's hard for me as a watching Ohio State all my life to not have an Ohio State bent to this. Like, that 95 Ohio State football team was as modern as any Ohio State football team I'd ever seen. So I think that's maybe why I immediately go to that era. And then I see that 95 team as that offense was not quite as rich man's version of the 94 Penn State offense. So I have an affinity for both of those, because, I mean, the offensive weapons that both of those teams had plays into that for me in terms of the modern, but that also floats right into the early 90s, late 80s as well. I don't know if we can put a year on it though, in terms, back then.
Yeah, it feels like we're sort of like narrowing the range a little bit now, where you're kind of zeroing in on about the time, and there's so much of it that's subjective, and it's just if I had to put a single 1 year on it, I would probably say 1992, although that was a split national championship season. I think that was Miami and Washington splitting the national championship that year, but that gets you past the Colorado and Georgia Tech splitting the national championship, which feels like it should be about 1937. But you're also in that college football, the championship, conference championship era. At that point, you've kind of started the expansion and realignment era a little bit. At that point, you're getting into the games are on TV, like, you've got a game on ESPN at noon and a game on ESPN at 3, and then you've got a game on ESPN2 at some point. And like, that was probably about that was like, I was in high school, I think, when ESPN2 came out. So that was probably about 1992 ish. I think that's when you're sort of getting into it. And, this is not a black and white, like, firm line, but to me, that's about when it starts. Like, you watch a college football broadcast and it's like, oh, this looks like college football. And, sometimes it's going to be a little bit slower, but it's not, the national championship team is throwing 6 passes and it's winning, in winning the national championship. It's like, okay, Miami looks like Miami. Florida State looks like Florida State. Florida looks like Florida. Ohio State looks like Ohio State. Wisconsin is like getting into being Wisconsin. Michigan, Penn State, like, they're in the right conferences at this, right around then. Like, that looks to me like college football. It's like, and a lot of those teams that were good back then are still pretty good now. And, I think that's going to be where I ultimately settle. Like, but you can say 1992 plus or minus 3 years, 4 years, something like that. That to me is about the right era, just in terms of teams, structure of the sport. If you want to say BCS, I think that's an acceptable answer too, where all of a sudden it is not just a split national championship. Like, you have one team. It is not 1997 where Michigan wins the national championship and Nebraska wins the national championship, and they don't play each other because they didn't play each other. The BCS is, I think, also, we kind of glossed over it earlier. I do think that's a pretty good answer as well, just in terms of that really changed the sport, because that was, before that, you had Scott Frost up on the podium after the what was the Orange Bowl, like lobbying for them to win a national championship because Tom Osborne was retiring, and it's like, this is how we used to settle the championship of the sport. Like, what? And Michigan plays what, number 12 Washington State, something like that. I mean, it wasn't like they had to play this incredible team to win the national championship. And 13 years before that, BYU wins the national championship in the Holiday Bowl by beating a 6-6 Michigan team. Like that is like very clearly not the same sport that we're talking about now, even though that BYU offense was kind of a modern power, passing offense. So there's a lot of this that's kind of subjective, but I feel like the answer has to be somewhere in the 90s, probably.
Well, because the start of the BCS then eventually leads to the playoffs, which some will tell you that modern football is 2014 with the start of the CFP. We are seeing all of these different things in college football, the transfer portal, the NIL stuff, these quarterbacks these players who go from one place to the other. What about 2011? Why 2011? Well, that was also that's the first year after Urban Meyer's era at Florida, where they rely on running the quarterback a lot to win their games. But it's also Cam Newton, 1 year rental, Russell Wilson, 1 year rental. You get into this where it's acceptable to just, hey, go transfer and play for a year there. Like Russell Wilson was basically, we don't want you anymore at North Carolina State. And, he was, I think, too involved in baseball, and football coach got angry. And so it became
good old Tom O'Brien.
Yeah. It kind of became, and, Cam Newton came from Blinn Community College, so it's not like he transferred, but you start to see these guys that can have an impact in 1 year. I don't, that's not my pick for a year. It's just interesting. Like, the quarterback's doing this. It's not new. There is a history of it. I was going through and just jotting down over the last 15 years the number of 4,000 yard passing teams to each year to see, like, again, I attribute modern to offense basically, because the defense has to respond to the offenses. But in 2009, 6 teams threw for over 4,000 yards. And then 6 years later, 2015, that number is up to 18. And it grows and grows. 2015 was the high water mark, but like to throw for over 4,000 yards now is for a season. It's not as much of a thing as it used to be. And I think I don't know when that began, but as I'm talking through all of this, Tom, I think I keep going back to, it's kind of like the cradle of civilization, Florida in the early 90s, where those 3 programs brought college football out of what it was in the Southwest and the Midwest, and then brought just spread. Now I would throw some credit also to Joe Tiller, who came to the Big Ten in 1997 and showed that, it's okay to throw the ball. And I know teams threw it a little bit before then, but he showed that you could do it and win. And it has never left since he arrived 25 almost years ago, and 25 years ago this year, in fact. So I think I will go with early 90s, which is surprising to me because I wasn't planning on that, but it's that's where the earliest ancestors of like the modern football. I wasn't planning on going there until you started talking about it, but yeah, early 90s with Florida State and Miami all coming up. I think maybe that's where I'm going to go 30 years ago. I don't know the exact date.
Yeah.
We'll have to carbon date it, but that feels pretty modern to me.
Yeah. I think between the TV piece of it and the, teams are you're starting to see teams in the right conferences at that point, and you're sort of starting to see the game looking a little bit more like the modern game. Yeah, I don't know exactly where. If you're like gun to my head, I'm saying 1992, which is just, again, like the start of that conference championship era.
Mm-hmm.
But the state of the geographical change of the state of Florida taking over a huge part of the game, like that just feels much more modern. I have a tough time viewing modern college football as Barry Switzer's running the wishbone, and you can, it's not, a lot of games aren't on TV, and that just doesn't feel quite right. So yeah, I think it's in that 1992 to 1998 window, if you want to include, the Tiller and the BCS thing. Like it's in that window somewhere. And as I'm saying this, like that's when I started watching college football seriously, like 1993, which is like that's my big concern is like, baseball is never better than the way it was played when you were a kid. Like 1980s baseball is my favorite kind of baseball, but it just, I think subjectively looking at it, it feels like that's where the game really changed to be much more of like the modern recognizable game where, you go back to the late 80s and it's just like Ohio State quarterbacks are, leading the team in passing. I'm just looking through right now, like leading passers by year, and till 1980, like Art Schleister's like game changer with a 2,500 yard season. And then no one else was over 2,000. Like Jim Carsato's got over 2,000 in the mid 80s.
Greg Frey did it 3 times.
Yeah, but it's just like, I mean, it's like 2,028, 2,132, 2,062. And then Bobby Hoying in 1995, 3,269 yards. And now that's like, well, that was 1,500 yards less than Dwayne Haskins had in 2018. But, that was like groundbreaking then. That 1995 Ohio State offense and Joe Germain, 3,330 yards in 1998. And that's where it starts looking more like football. And it's a little less like the Woody Hayes has completely washed out of the program by that point. And then, Walt Harris and what was then a like revolutionary, like, can you believe Ohio State's throwing for like 300 yards a game sometimes? Like crazy.
Yeah. The brow ridge is diminished, and you start to look more like the modern human. So I think I don't know that we've convinced anybody. I think I'm okay with my answer. I'm okay with what we've come up with, and maybe what we're talking about now, like 2021, things are changing. We'll see where they go. I tend to think that the concerns are overblown, but it's certainly different than it was. And where it ends up, we got time. We got plenty of time to worry about it, plenty of time to talk about it, and then again, plenty of time to worry even more about it. Anything else, Tom, before we go? Any last thoughts on any of this?
I like the fact that you came around to my thinking eventually, which is good. That means finally you've landed on the correct answer, and I appreciate that. I'm glad. I don't know if anyone else agrees with me, but as long as I've talked you off, to the correct answer, then that's, I think, the most important thing.
Well, and it's just, it really struck me with the Florida thing, because I even, you go to like Troy Smith winning the Heisman, throwing for 2,500 yards.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how is that modern? Mm-hmm. But OSU is running a spread offense, and I know other people like, well, no, they weren't at Jim Tressel. How could they? No, they were running a spread offense. They also still ran plenty of I formation, but they would actually put 5 receivers out, 4 receivers out, and spread teams out and just let Troy Smith pick them apart. But, Jim Tressel's offense held him to the low numbers, not any defense or anything like that. But I can't go against as a child of as 90s had the best music. I think we all know that. 90s and late 80s had the best Big Ten basketball. And this, Tom, I don't know what the opposite of recency bias. We know this cannot be recency bias. So
nostalgia bias? I don't know.
Fact bias is what I like to call it. So, all right, that will do it. I hope if you guys have your own thoughts, feel free to share them with Tom on Twitter, email. I can give you his email address.
There you go.
But if you guys have any other thoughts, feel free to let us know. We're on Twitter. We're on the message board. Just a thought provoking conversation. Thank you for the question. Whoever asked it, I was looking for the link, Tom, and your text, and I could not find it. I stopped looking though before I found it. But seriously, thank you for that. If that was you, hit us up. We'll give you credit. And so that will do it for this episode. I'm glad we've got everybody on board and in agreement about such a wide-ranging and broad question. So thank you for that. Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in, and we will talk to you guys tomorrow.